Is JavaScript being overused on the modern web, and is it to blame for many of the problems we see in performance across the internet? I recently came across this video titled How JavaScript Ruined the Web, so I'm going to break down this video a bit and give my own perspective on the situation, both where I agree and disagree with the original creator, and sort of my opinions on what we can be doing in the future to actually improve the overall situation. And of course, big shout out to the original creator Eric Murphy for actually giving me permission to react to this video on my channel. His channel will be linked down in the description. He makes amazing content, so do consider subscribing to him as well.
Let's talk about the modern web. Everybody kind of knows how bad the modern web is these days, and I'm sure you've experienced it firsthand, because sites like Reddit, which went from being a well-designed, if not a little bit dated website, now it is a slow, buggy monstrosity that loads in megabytes of trackers and lags my browser every time I navigate to it.
Yeah, so this is definitely a real issue. Back in the day, we probably just downloaded 3 files, HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. Now, like you can see, there's hundreds of files being downloaded. This can really slow down the overall process of loading a website, especially for people with slower internet connections.
And the old version of Reddit was perfectly fine, so why did they have to make it almost completely unusable now? Even simple informational websites like news websites or recipe sites, they have been so jam-packed with so many scripts that it can take minutes to fully load a simple web page.
So one thing to point out here is most of what's actually taking a while on this particular website to load seems to be the advertisements, which I think is perfectly fine if the main content loads first, and then the advertisements take a little bit of time. Of course, I'd rather an internet with no advertisements, but the reality is that's impossible because we have to pay for it somehow, and I don't want an internet where I have to pay for everything like a recipe website. So I do think it's super important to understand what exactly he's doing here and how you can actually evaluate your own websites. So I'm going to go to Reddit just because it's the example he uses a lot in the video, and we're going to open up the network tab in the Chrome Inspector. And what we want to do is first of all disable the cache to make sure we're loading the page sort of like it's a first ever load. And then we're going to throttle the internet. I'm going to put it on fast 3G. You can use whatever throttling you want, but it just helps us sort of see what it looks like on a slower connection and sort of elongate everything so we can look at it more closely. Then I'm going to click this little record button and refresh the page so that we can see what all of the requests that are being made as we refresh it. And then I will stop the recording once the page finishes loading. All right, so the page just finished loading, and now we can see we have all of these different requests that were made, and I've got this big waterfall column open up pretty wide because that's the one I find most important, but we can see all of the different requests. So we started out with this initial request, and then we can see it requested all of these things, and then we requested all of this, and we can see most of these are scripts like he's talking about, so that's why it takes so long sometimes to load a page, because we have so many different scripts that we need to download. And then we have a bunch of other content as well. And you can see with this waterfall what's essentially taking the longest. So this is the sort of main page, and we can see that it takes 573 milliseconds for this waiting or TTFB, which is going to be time till first bit. So essentially, how long did it take before we saw something back from the server? So this could either be time because the server was slow or time because the actual connection to the internet was slow. And then we have the content download. So how long it actually took to download the content of this request, which in this case was 433 milliseconds, which is going to directly relate to both the speed of the internet as well as just the size of the file we are downloading. And one other thing I like to do is close this out and for one, come to the waterfall and see if anything just looks like it's taking up a lot of space and looks like it's blocking other things. So if there's only one thing happening at some given moment, that thing is probably blocking everything else from happening and trying to avoid that blocking. And then also just looking at the things with the largest size. So we can sort by the size and we can see the biggest items at the top. You can just sort of go through these on your own website and see, are there things here that are just completely unnecessary or things that we can make smaller with some form of compression. Now, the next thing I want to do is also look at the performance tab. So the network tab is going to show us how long it took something to download, and the performance tab is sort of going to show us the performance once something is downloaded. So we can come here and we can also do different throttling. So we can throttle our network and we can throttle our CPU if we want. So I'm going to go to 6 times slowdown. I am on a very powerful machine, so this will make it feel a little bit more sluggish. And then we can either click record or just this button, which is going to refresh the page and record. So I'm going to go ahead and do that. And we can see it shows that it's profiling and it's refreshing the page. And this is going to take a little bit, but then I will stop it once the page finishes loading. Okay, so the profile is complete. And I'm sure this just looks like a giant mess, and it sort of is. It can be kind of hard to look at, but this information is actually very good information. So first of all, we have our main thread here, and this is the one that's important because the main thread is the actual thread that most of our code is running on. This is what's essentially going to block the page. So if we come to the main thread, we can see this sort of snapshot of what all of the different time was. So we spent 3,207 milliseconds running scripts. We spent 4,644 milliseconds rendering the page, 122 milliseconds painting, and 4,000 on just system things, and 7,000 milliseconds idle. So it's important to note that we have so much idle time here, and this is just time that the main thread isn't doing anything. So it's probably just waiting for some download to come back, something like that. It's just not actually doing anything. Then we spent a lot of time on actually executing scripts and a lot of time on rendering. So this is going to be the time that's related to our JavaScript, and this is going to be the time mostly related to CSS, or potentially CSS that we're changing with our JavaScript. So you can sort of look at these different areas and see which ones are the worst and at which points in our sort of overall timeline of this graph of the page loading, and see, okay, I'm spending too much time on JavaScript here and it's sort of causing a bottleneck, or maybe just the actual painting and rendering process is taking too long here. So can I simplify things? Can I use simpler CSS, or can you just remove things like animations that might be completely unnecessary?
And so in this video, I want to go over how this happened. So the simple answer for a lot of this is the web's current obsession with JavaScript. Now, of course, there's nothing wrong with JavaScript. People like to dog on JavaScript.
There's a few things wrong with JavaScript, let's be honest here.
A lot, but inherently there's nothing really wrong with it. If you want to have any sort of interactivity on your website, you're going to use it. But the problem really arrived with the popularity of JavaScript frameworks. So maybe you've heard of React, Angular, Vue, and many more frameworks like this. These are basically tools that web developers use that abstract a lot of things in development away to make it easier to create richer, more dynamic web applications. So basically what I'm saying is these JavaScript frameworks allow for highly interactive web apps with a lot of moving parts. And that's basically what they're used for, because the most popular, React, it was originally developed by Facebook. And that's because it's very hard to have a website with the level of complexity that Facebook has without using a complex JavaScript framework.
Yeah, so this is a really good point that I see people overlook sometimes, where people are just like, why do we need any of these things like React, Angular, etc.? And if you look at a website like Facebook, it's far too complicated to make vanilla. It would be nearly impossible to have that level of complexity done completely vanilla, or if it was possible, it would take far more actual development hours to do. It's just going to be much harder to actually build the application without it.
And so these JavaScript frameworks, they work best as single page applications. So these are basically websites that you would expect to behave like applications. So for something like an admin dashboard, it makes sense to use one of these frameworks because you're going to be constantly creating and adding and editing things, and you don't really want to have the page refresh every time you take an action. That would get really annoying really fast. And so these frameworks work best for websites that have kind of a medium level of interactivity. That's kind of the sweet spot for these JavaScript frameworks.
So I'm curious what exactly he means by a medium level of interactivity, because if something had high interactivity, you'd also probably need a framework or library for it. But regardless, the point of simple websites with low interactivity don't need frameworks or libraries absolutely is true.
But the problem comes with how widespread the adoption of these JavaScript frameworks was. Now, look, some of these websites, they make sense using something like React, but soon enough, cooking websites were using React, news websites were using React, Reddit's now using React.
Yeah, so it's definitely true that websites are overusing React, and your personal portfolio or your blog probably doesn't need React. Although I think some of the examples he's giving aren't the best. Like Reddit is a very interactive and sophisticated web application, and I think it totally makes sense for them to be using something like React.
And none of these websites really need to use React. The front end of these websites doesn't really need to be that complex. But the reason why React and these other JavaScript frameworks really took the internet by storm is because of how they were marketed. So basically, whenever these first came out, they were the next greatest thing in web development. And if you were a web developer back then, I mean, even now, you're basically an idiot if you're not using one of these new frameworks. You're basically stuck in the past, and if you're still working in something like PHP, people are laughing at you. And these new frameworks aren't even necessarily better than the old way that people were doing things. It's more of just peer pressure because everybody else is doing it.
So better is definitely a subjective term, but I will say in these circumstances that these frameworks and libraries were actually designed to be used in, they are objectively better than just doing vanilla development. Now, are they being used in scenarios they weren't designed for? Absolutely. But for what they were actually made for, I would say they are actually better.
These days, people will ask if they should learn React, one of these JavaScript frameworks, before even learning JavaScript itself.
Yeah, so I probably get that question like once every day or two. And no, you should not learn React before you learn JavaScript. That doesn't even make sense.
And I've been a web developer for a long time. And for a long time, I was just happily making HTML and CSS websites when I was a kid. And then I later moved on to WordPress websites if a client needed it. But I was working on pretty basic websites. But once you start following any web developer influencers, I'm talking about the guys on Twitter who are always talking about the new.
So in fairness, this is the React Twitter page, or X page, I guess. So of course they're going to be talking about React.
New, latest, greatest technology that everybody needs to be using right now. So you would hear these people on Twitter or on a podcast or see a blog post by them. They were always talking about how you need to do things the new and improved way. Or basically you're going to get left behind because this was presented as the future of web development. And nobody wants to be left behind. And so of course that's what I learned. I started getting into React. But soon people were using React even to build things like static websites. So I'm talking about a very basic website, maybe a blog, maybe a web page for your dog. And people were so into doing things this new and improved way, the JavaScript framework way, that they came up with this thing called Gatsby. So Gatsby was a really cool static site generator, but powered by React. And so you could have a blog or just a simple informational website, but once your website loaded, it hydrated into a fully featured React app. And you get these cool seamless transitions, like you click onto a new page and it doesn't reload the page. It just kind of instantly takes you there. And I remember thinking that this was the coolest thing ever. It was really slick. And so, of course, I built my personal website with this framework. Why wouldn't I? But then after I finished with it, it felt a little bit weird because my website was loading slower than before. So at the time, the slogan for this framework, the slogan was, it was fast in every way that matters. And it definitely felt very slick, but very slow. Because when you first try this, it does feel a little bit faster because, like I said, it doesn't have to reload the page in order to get new data. But the initial page load of loading my website in for the first time was noticeably much slower.
So honestly, I don't know that much about Gatsby in particular, but if you have a completely static website, it should be possible in theory to build that website in React, server render it, and send just HTML and CSS back to the client, and it should work just like a vanilla website for the client. Of course, that's not always what ends up happening, but it should be possible.
That's because it had to load in all of this JavaScript and parse all of it before it even displayed any HTML. And of course, parsing hundreds of kilobytes of JavaScript takes much longer than parsing maybe 100 kilobytes of CSS or HTML. And so after I built this was my first inclination into realizing that something might be wrong with modern web development. Why am I building this simple website which should just be HTML and CSS? Why does this need React? Of course, this is a very extreme example, building a completely static website with React, but it just left me with kind of a bad taste in my mouth. Like, really? This is supposed to be the future of web development? Not to mention that the process of building this website caused so many headaches. So I was building my website with Gatsby version 1, but you know, in tech these days, people like to move fast and break things. And so while I was working on this project, they upgraded to version 2 of Gatsby. And switching to it was a major headache because there were so many incompatibilities between the two versions. I essentially had to completely rewrite my website. And this is just kind of the feel of working with these modern web frameworks. Everything's always changing and you constantly need to be on top of things. And if you're migrating to a new version, things are just going to break. You're just going to have to rewrite things and fix things.
Yeah, so I've definitely experienced this too. I've had projects I've gone back to a year or two later after initially creating them and half of it's broken and it basically won't build until I update everything. Then when I update things, some of the old functions stop working, and it's a huge pain. If you use more mature libraries and frameworks, like he said he was using Gatsby version 1, it tends to not happen as much, but it can be a real issue.
Because there's so many moving parts in your website that you need to pull in all of these dependencies from all different kinds of people. So even just a basic hello world example these days, at least for Gatsby, this framework I was working in at the time, it brings in like 1,000 packages. And all of these packages add up to hundreds of megabytes just to create this very basic hello world example. It's really ridiculous. And you can imagine what happens when websites are so complex. They really become fragile. And a lot of these projects, if you come back a year or two later and you try to download them again and edit something with it, it literally doesn't work because everything has changed. Like the Node.js version has changed. And so it's no longer compatible with all of these old libraries. And if you upgrade some of these libraries, then they're incompatible with other libraries. It's really a major headache working with all of these frameworks because there are so many moving parts. But with everything I've told you, you might now be wondering why anybody would want to use one of these complex frameworks. Like, it might make sense if you have a complex web application that has a lot of interactivity, but most websites using these bloated frameworks don't meet these descriptions at all. But one big reason why a lot of people use these frameworks is the so-called developer experience. So this is kind of a marketing term that a lot of these frameworks throw out. And so what this essentially is it's the most fun technology for developers to use.
So I actually would push back on that. I don't think it's just the most fun technology to use. It's the most efficient technology to use. Because ultimately, can we make a page load 50% faster by not using React? Maybe. But if that page load to be 50% faster is going to take 500 times as much developer time, well, then it's never going to be made anyways. So a lot of this is not just about what's the most fun to use, although some of it is, but a lot of it is more about what is the most efficient developer workflow.
That's really what the developer experience boils down to. Because when you use one of these frameworks, it does a lot of nice things for you. Like I said, it does things like minify your JavaScript, minify your CSS. These days with every framework, you can have hot reloading, so you make one change to the website in development and it instantly updates while you're working on it.
You can also get hot reloading on vanilla development using a VS Code extension like Live Server. So I would say the developer experience, well, that's sort of part of it, but the bigger portion of the developer experience is just how easy it is to actually write the code.
And if you had been like me and been making websites the old way for a decade before, then the first time you use a JavaScript framework, it seems almost magical. You can easily import snippets and libraries from millions of NPM packages with a simple terminal command. And the idea is that if you make things easier for developers, then it's going to kind of trickle down into a better user experience. If we can develop new features faster, of course that will make everything better for the users, right? Not only that, but working in decades-old technology is boring, and the newest framework trending on Twitter is much more appealing than using what you always have.
Yeah, so this is definitely important too. If you imagine that you're like Google and you're trying to hire the sort of top talent, that's going to be much easier if you're using the sort of trendy technology that top talent would rather be using.
It can also be fun to imagine yourself using the cutting-edge technology that a startup would be using. Like, maybe you got a job at the New York Times, an old dusty newspaper, but you wish you were working at Twitter, so you use all of the cool new technology that they use. And so if all of these tools are making the developers more efficient, what's wrong with that? Of course, all of this comes at a cost, and probably the biggest cost is performance. And I'm sure you've heard that if your website is slow, then you're probably going to lose business. Because if you're a customer that's going to your website for the first time and it's very slow to load and very laggy, of course, people aren't going to stay on your website for very long.
So one thing I will say here is if we look at the actual recording he has here, it shows that he has it set to slow 3G in the network tab. So essentially what that does is it puts a maximum bandwidth on your connection at I think either 500 or 400 kilobits per second. So because of that, it's going to load slow. Like there's some images here that are taking a while to load because guess what? Images are large files. So while it is true that some of these slow loading can come from JavaScript and things like that, a lot of it just comes from media on the web. So unless you advocate for an internet with no images and no sort of rich media, it's going to load slow if you throttle the network that heavily.
But these kinds of performance regressions aren't really felt until much later, until it's actively hurting the business. Because whenever you first use these frameworks, they feel pretty fast until you have to load in all of the dependencies and all of the ads and trackers that are also required on your website. And after you add in everything, it really slows the website to a crawl. But let's also talk about who this affects, because let's face it, a lot of developers are using M1 MacBook Pro with 16 gigabytes of RAM. So that's on the developer side of things. These are the people in Silicon Valley, California, and they're using top-of-the-line equipment with blazing fast internet connections in developed countries. But of course, this affects people using rural connections and those in developing countries. They don't always have the fastest internet. Not to mention that, but a lot of people are using older devices with 4 gigabytes of RAM or less. And this noticeably affects how long the page loads because, again, it has to parse all of the JavaScript. That takes computing power. And this becomes even worse on phones because, let's face it, a lot of people, most people these days use the internet on their phone.
Yeah, so this is true, and it's something we need to think about a lot as we're building websites, especially if we're trying to build websites that need to be accessible everywhere. But at the same time, there's sort of a trade-off here because if we try to make our website work optimally for absolutely everybody, then we're sort of not utilizing any of the new capabilities we have with modern internet, with fiber internet, with better computers, things like that. So I think what's super important is trying to build experiences that can be incredible for that person with the fiber internet and the M1 MacBook, but can also be a usable and good experience for somebody using an iPhone 6 with a 3G connection. And there's actually a lot of things we can do to achieve that. For example, if you have a website with a lot of images, one thing you can do is sort of detect how fast is this internet going to be. And there's a lot of different ways you can go about doing that, but you can try to detect how fast is my user's internet and say if they're below some threshold, don't send them the images on the initial load. That way the page can load and just give them buttons to say, hey, here's the alternative text of this image. If you want to actually see the image, click this and I'll download it for you. That way they can get to the initial page load much quicker. You can also do things like removing animations and unnecessary scripts and all of these different things that might be unnecessary for these users so you can give them the best possible experience while not hindering the experience of people who do have that better internet connection and the better computer.
And these websites just drain your battery like no tomorrow. Have you ever navigated to one of these websites on your phone and just literally watched as your battery drops before your very eyes? And these sites just provide a worse user experience. So have you ever clicked the back button just to find out that it doesn't work like you would expect it to? That's because the back button has been hijacked by the JavaScript framework that website is using.
So the back button thing is completely preventable, but it does absolutely happen and it is a bad user experience. That said, I wouldn't say that these frameworks and libraries and all this extra JavaScript is providing worse user experiences. If that was the case, companies would stop doing it because ultimately bad user experience is bad business, but they continue to do it because they know it creates good user experiences. And if you were to look back at some of these same websites 10 years ago, they had worse user experiences. They might have loaded a little bit faster, but the overall user experience once you got to the website was worse. And that's not to say we have perfect UX now because we absolutely don't, but I think it has been getting better over time. It just has also started taking more resources over time, but we also have better computers and better internet connections over time too.
And if they didn't implement it correctly, well, oops. And have you ever gotten caught in an infinite loading circle? Well, that's just because all of the JavaScript didn't load in. Because a lot of these frameworks, they initially load in no HTML at all, and they only load in JavaScript. And don't worry guys, because that's a feature, not a bug. And if the JavaScript doesn't load in for whatever reason, well, let's not worry about that.
Yeah, so server-side rendering sort of handles this and gives you actual HTML when you first load the page. And I think that's something that needs to become more and more standardized, and it is starting to become more standardized, which is good.
And so that is why every website these days just feels slow and bloated and buggy. Now, a lot of people have already complained about this. I'm definitely not the first person to notice this, but as a web developer myself, I actually want to see the web become better. And there is some light at the end of the tunnel because a lot of newer tools are starting to move away from this idea that everything has to be a single page app. So some newer frameworks like Astro, which I've previously covered on this channel, They combine things like the nice developer experience of using frameworks like React while keeping the end user in mind. So you can use all of your cool JavaScript frameworks, but when the site builds, it only uses JavaScript when necessary. So it still loads in HTML and CSS like you would expect, and it only uses JavaScript when the site actually needs it to be interactive.
Yeah, absolutely agree. I think tools like Astro are absolutely going to be the future as we go back to simpler websites on the client side and having as much of that complex JavaScript as possible running on the server side.
And this is how things are supposed to be. Now, people are finally kind of waking up to this situation, and people are taking the trend of more sensible frameworks with less JavaScript shipped to the end user. And I do think it is a good thing, but I still think that it's kind of going in the wrong direction because the build process is still extremely complex and fragile. Like in Astro, this framework that I reviewed, it still needs 146 megabytes of dependencies just to build a basic hello world with Astro. So I'm still not completely sold on some of these new frameworks.
So I think it just depends on what you're building. Like if you're building your own personal website, Astro or something like it, probably overkill. But if you're trying to build an actual large application, you are going to need frameworks and libraries. Otherwise, it's just going to be a much slower development process. So I think these tools are good, but we do still need to be making sure that we are using the correct tool for the given job.
Now, it should go without saying, but for simple websites that don't have a lot of interactivity, JavaScript is almost never needed. There are things like static site generators now, like Hugo, which I have covered in the past. That is still one of my favorite tools that I use to build websites. But these tools like Hugo, they have never been better, and you can build huge, complex sites quickly, and you don't have to query a database for every post like you do with something like WordPress. So for building small to medium-sized websites, this is definitely the best option, I think. But I think just being aware of all of the issues with the modern web is the best first step. And when you're building a new website or a new project, really ask yourself, do you need a JavaScript framework? Even if it seems like you're saving a lot of time at the beginning, you can run into a lot of issues down the line with these, especially when we're talking about performance, which can definitely impact if people actually want to use your website or not. And so before you start a new project, just ask yourself, does it need this framework? And is there any better, more efficient way to build what I'm thinking about?
Yeah, so absolutely agree. As you're making projects, it's super important to make sure that you are actually thinking about every single dependency you add and making sure you just actually need that dependency. So overall, great video. Let me know what y'all think of it down in the comments below. And again, big shout out to Eric for the permission to use this video. I'll link to the original video right here so that you can check that out and make sure to subscribe to his channel as well.